Today we'll be continuing our discussion of British taxation of its American colonies and colonial protest over those taxes, and how this repeating pattern of taxation and protest will contribute directly to the escalating tension between the American colonies and the British government. In 1766, after the British government had repealed the Stamp Act due in large part to colonial protest, they decided to shift their tax policy back to indirect taxes, like the Sugar Act, a tax on imports. So in 67, the Parliament will pass the Townshend Acts. This is another tax on imported goods into the colonies. Townshend was the name of the Chancellor of the Exchequer. It's kind of like our modern day Secretary of Treasury. Charles Townshend was he was basically in charge of all the British government's money. So in his opinion, the best way to raise money in order to pay for England's war debt was to begin or to continue taxing the colonies using the import taxes, or these taxes on imports. These indirect taxes were the most productive way of raising this money. So the Townshend Acts will be a tax on imports, but in this case they're going to expand the list of items that are going to be taxed, and a lot of these are more or less non-luxury items or luxury goods. When we saw the Sugar Act, it was that tax was focused primarily on luxury imports. The Townshend Acts are going to focus primarily on everyday items, non-luxury goods, things like glass, lead, paint, paper, tea is going to be part of this Townshend tax as well. So these are more everyday items. A lot of businesses especially use things like glass and lead and paint, paper, and so forth. Tea is going to be something that's used by everyone. Everyone in the colonies is drinking tea. It's just kind of the go-to drink of choice. At any rate, this is represents kind of an expansion of these import taxes in an attempt to raise more money. Now, none of these taxes are oppressive in and of themselves, but they add up a little bit here, a little bit there, and then England is hoping to generate enough revenue to start paying down their debt. In addition, this Townshend Act will create a Board of Customs Commissioners. Basically, these people will be designated by Parliament, by the government, as the ones to go out to enforce the trade and import laws that are already on the books. They'll be working, of course, with the colonial courts and the writs of assistance and the vice admiralty courts in an attempt to prevent smuggling and black market business. So these Board of Customs Commissioners, these are the ones responsible for enforcing trade laws. Now, what happens here is that in many cases, these customs commissioners, they're not paid a salary per se. What they're paid is they get paid a percentage of any illegal goods that are seized as a result of their inspections. So it's in their interest to find something. When they come to your warehouse or to your ship to inspect it for black market cargo or smuggled goods, it's in their interest to find something, because that's the only way they're going to get paid. They get paid a percentage of the cargo that is seized. So even if there's something there that there's nothing there illegal, they're going to find something. So what this contributes to a lot of corruption. Basically, people, the smugglers or the shippers or the warehouse workers, in an attempt to try and prevent these customs inspectors from seizing all of their cargo, they will set aside a small amount of cargo as kind of for lack of a better term, a gift or a bribe to the inspector. They say, okay, when you inspect the cargo in this warehouse, be sure to focus on this corner over here, this little pallet. There's something on there you might be interested in. And of course, the customs inspector will see that. Okay, yeah, I'll take all this, and then I won't inspect the rest of the cargo. I'll just go ahead and take this as my bribe, and go on. So this contributes to corruption. Corrupt inspectors will find things even when there's nothing there to there's no violations. They'll make up a violation in order to be able to seize the cargo. And of course, smugglers will often offer bribes to the inspectors to prevent them from looking at everything in the warehouse. Again, this creates a lot of opportunity for corruption and bribery and so forth. So black marketing and smuggling is going to continue in the wake of these taxes. And in fact, this is very often the case throughout history. One of the easiest ways to avoid the taxes is to buy smuggled goods or buy goods on the black market. That way you can avoid having to pay the tax on these imported items. But in '68, the Massachusetts General Court is going to draft a letter of protest over these new taxes, the Townshend Acts, all these new import taxes. Now, this circular letter drafted in 1768. This is the work of just the Massachusetts colonial government. This is not everybody. This is not all the colonies participating here, like the Stamp Act Congress. That was all the colonies got together in New York to discuss a common issue. This circular letter only involves Massachusetts. Massachusetts here is operating on their own, independently of the rest of the colonies. So they draft the Massachusetts General Court, that's just Massachusetts colonial government. They draft this circular letter, and in it is a very harshly worded condemnation of the Townshend Acts. In Massachusetts, a lot of there were quite a few radicals in the Massachusetts area. We talked about Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty. So a lot of these guys in Massachusetts, they are some of the strongest voices of opposition to British taxation. And Sam Adams is kind of driving this whole push for this circular letter. He wants this to be a dramatic statement. He doesn't want there to be any doubt in anyone's mind what this letter is trying to communicate. They declare basically that they're not subject to these taxes. They kind of nullify these taxes. They don't want to participate in them. They don't recognize British authority to pass these types of taxes. They consider the Townshend Acts an infringement of their natural rights. Again, they're kind of citing some Enlightenment ideals here in terms of Republican government and so forth. So the circular letter basically is a declaration by the Massachusetts colonial government that the Townshend Acts are unconstitutional. England has no right to pass these taxes. And it's a very strongly worded letter, very critical of the British government. And this letter is going to be circulated through the other colonial governments. Basically, what the Massachusetts General Court does, they draft copies of the letter and they send it to all the other 13 colonies. And this is basically they're kind of trying to drum up support for their position. Keep in mind, Massachusetts is kind of the squeaky wheel in this story. Over this time period, Massachusetts was the most vocal in their opposition to the British government. The other colonies tended to agree somewhat with Massachusetts, but Massachusetts was kind of the leader of this opposition movement, this protest movement. So they send this letter out to all the other colonies. Basically it's if you agree with us, check here. What ends up happening is that while this letter was not sent to the British government, this is just Massachusetts trying to generate support among its neighbors for this type of protest. Well, word of this will eventually get back to the British government. Parliament will hear about this, the King will hear about this, and there's a lot of people in the British government now that are very upset about this circular letter criticizing the British government so harshly. What ends up happening is that in response to this, the British government is going to station more troops in Boston. About 4,000 British troops are going to be pulled off of the frontier and redeployed into the Boston area. And it's at this point where we see the British government begin to single out Boston from among the other 13 colonies. Massachusetts here becomes the focus of British attention. Up to this point, England just kind of looked at the colonies as all 13 separate colonies. They didn't think of the colonies as being united in any way. At this point, England starts to recognize that Boston now, Massachusetts and Boston specifically, is trying to generate support for a larger protest movement. And this, from the English perspective, looks as though Boston is kind of an instigator of trouble. So this is why England decides to station more troops in Boston. This is going to create a lot of problems in and of itself. And we'll talk about some of those specifically here in just a minute. Taking a look at this map here, we looked at this map earlier in the week, or actually later last week. We see here in by 1775, Boston is pretty much completely occupied by military troops. There's, in fact, by on the eve of the Revolution, Boston is under British military rule, and we're kind of starting to see why that's the case. Why on the eve of the Revolution, Boston was so much more controlled by the military than any other city in the colonies. The reason for this is that England starts to look at Boston as a hotbed of colonial protest. So Boston becomes the focus of British attention after this circular letter. They start sending more troops into Boston than they have in any other city. Boston is the squeaky wheel. They're the ones that are getting all the negative attention from England. And this is what's going to lead directly to an event that happens a couple of years later, the Boston Massacre. Boston Massacre is one of those events in American history that has become it's kind of a touchstone moment. It's an iconic moment, a defining event in our history, not just in the history of the nation, but in the history of our culture. We look at this as one of those formative moments in the story of our culture. It was a relatively small scale incident. Despite the drama suggested by the title, this was actually pretty much a low-key event, pretty small scale, and it was over in a few hours. But it becomes a very important turning point in our story, especially when we talk about the formation of colonial unity and this attitude of the American colonies against England in this struggle for independence. This is one of those formative moments that's gonna shape that story to a great extent. And this is a direct result of those additional British troops being stationed in Boston. So for the past 2 years, the people of Boston have had to live in a situation where they've got 4,000 British soldiers on patrol in and around the Boston area, and this has become very frustrating to the British people, or to the people of Boston. People of Boston, remember, from the time this city was founded, they had in their minds this idea of self-governance, independence. This was part of their culture. Part of the Boston and the Massachusetts culture is this idea of independence and self-governance. So the presence of British troops here in Boston, especially in such large numbers, it runs contrary to their beliefs in self-government. So this is very aggravating and distressing to the people of Boston. And over the 2 years between the time the British troops arrive as in response to this circular letter and this Boston Massacre, there's a lot of little skirmishes here and there. Protests and skirmishes, people arrested, people protesting the presence of the British soldiers. And this Boston Massacre is just kind of the climax of this period of protests surrounding the presence of British soldiers. So basically, this event begins. This is in March of 1770. This happens in the Boston Commons, basically the town square there in Boston. And what happens is that there was already a protest taking place. One of the regular periodic protests among the people of Boston over the presence of British troops. And what ends up happening is that a British soldier who's on guard outside the customs house, and customs houses were common places of protest. This is where the taxes were collected. These were seen as symbols of British corruption and British interference in colonial affairs. So the customs house is kind of an obvious target here. So a British soldier standing guard outside the customs house is being harassed by this group of colonial protesters, Boston protesters. In the course of this protest and harassment, it starts to escalate. More people or bystanders, they see what's going on and they start to join the protest. And the soldier gets kind of nervous, and he sends word back to his garrison for assistance. So basically, the officer in charge sends a squad of additional soldiers down to the customs house to reinforce this soldier who's on guard. So we've got a situation now where there's already a protest in progress, and and the target of this protest is this British soldier standing outside guarding the customs house. At this moment, additional British soldiers arrive on the scene. They were called for backup. Now, it's not a mob, it's not a whole army of British soldiers, just a half a dozen or so additional soldiers show up on the scene. The officer in charge sent them there to help stabilize the situation, to keep this situation from getting out of control. But what happens is that when the protesters see more troops show up, even though it's just a small number of them, they see it as, okay, they're sending out the troops to oppress us even more. This angers the mob. They get more excited and more upset, and so this has just the opposite effect. Instead of settling things down, this actually escalates the tension on the scene. And of course, over the course of the next few hours, the number of protesters grows, and they become more belligerent and more angry. And they begin throwing snowballs. Again, this is March. There's still snow on the ground in Boston. They're throwing snowballs at the troops, just kind of harassing them. And these are professional soldiers. This is not their first experience in the field. They're trained and disciplined, so everybody knows this snowball's not going to hurt you. So they just kind of dismiss it as people being rowdy. But eventually, what happens is that somebody decides it would be fun to start throwing rocks instead of snowballs. Now the situation has escalated even further. Now the British soldiers are getting hit with rocks, and the situation becomes more serious. They're being injured, and they're starting to be concerned for their safety. And keep in mind too, while these are professional soldiers, they're not veterans of many combat campaigns. Most of these are new soldiers. This is one of their first deployments. While they've had training and some experience, most of that experience is in war fighting. Soldiers are trained to fight battles. They're not trained to serve as police against unarmed civilians. It's not part of their training. And this is one of the reasons why today we don't like to use troops in a domestic situation. And there's been very few cases throughout our history where we'll use soldiers in a case of civil unrest. That's a police function. So these soldiers are not trained in crowd control. They're trained in fighting battles. So they're young. They're somewhat inexperienced. Their training is not suited to this task. And so we see kind of this contributing to the problem. As these soldiers start to get nervous and panic, what ends up happening is that one of them accidentally fires into the crowd. Basically, what happens at this point is the whole situation spirals out of control. One young soldier, in fear of his safety, fires nervously, and this starts a chain reaction. The other soldiers that are on guard there, they're not sure what happened. Some of them are like, okay, are they shooting at us? Is that the protesters shooting at us? What's going on? Should we fire back? And there's a breakdown in command and control here. The person in charge of this group of soldiers is uncertain as to what happens, and basically it just kind of escalates very quickly, and more of the soldiers begin firing. And in the end, when the smoke clears, 5 protesters have been shot and killed. There's a few others that are wounded, but five protesters end up being killed in this exchange of fire. So despite the title here, massacre, only 5 people were killed. Now, even if one person was killed, it's a tragedy. But we usually don't think in terms of when we think in terms of a massacre, we think in terms of large numbers. We usually wouldn't consider 5 people killed a massacre. But what's going to happen is that this event, again, it's over in just a few hours. From start to finish, it's over in a few hours. And once the dust settles, these 5 people are killed. The crowd disperses, and of course the British soldiers regroup, and then they set about the task of bringing order to the situation. So this Boston Massacre is going to be an important moment in that this will shape public opinion in the colonies toward the British government. What was an unfortunate tragedy, everything that was depicted in that image was not a total lie. People were killed by British soldiers. British soldiers were there in Boston Commons, and they fired at unarmed civilians, and some of those civilians were killed. All of that is true, but the context is what is so distorted by that image. The facts still remain, and the facts are that the British soldiers killed unarmed Boston civilians, and that's going to carry a lot of weight in terms of shaping public opinion. On both sides of this story, though, cooler heads will prevail. In the days after the massacre, a lot of people will call for the lynching of these British soldiers. How dare they murder our innocent brothers here in Boston? We need to round them up and execute them. And of course, that would have been unfortunate if something like that had happened, because that would just been an escalation of an already tense situation, and would almost certainly have brought an increase in British troops and retribution from the British government. So these soldiers that participated in this incident are going to be put on trial in a court in Boston, and a Boston attorney, Boston lawyer named John Adams, this is the brother of Samuel Adams, is going to, actually I think it's his cousin. At any rate, John Adams, Boston lawyer, will volunteer to defend these soldiers at their trial. And this is important because Adams is putting his career on the line here, because a lot of people don't like the fact that Adams, a Boston native, is going to volunteer to defend these British troops. But it's important because Adams is able to kind of calm things down a little bit. Adams presents the case in defense of these soldiers. He says they're not murderers, they're not ruthless oppressors, they were soldiers doing their job, and they got caught in the midst of a situation that was out of their control, and they panicked. There's blame on both sides of this situation. Adams paints it as kind of an unfortunate tragedy that could have been avoided if cooler heads had prevailed on that day. What ends up happening, bottom line, is that the soldiers did receive a fair trial. The charges of murder were dropped. Most of them are going to be acquitted of these charges of murder, and only a couple of them are going to end up going to jail, and the charges were reduced to something like manslaughter. But so they're going to be treated fairly, and they received kind of a lenient punishment. This is going to make a lot of people in Boston unhappy, because they kind of wanted quote-unquote justice, which very often is a euphemism for revenge. But thanks to people like John Adams, who were able to kind of diffuse the situation, the people of Boston and the British government are able to move past this incident without any further escalation. So people are going to calm down. They're going to move past this. They'll mourn the deaths of the victims, and they'll move on. On the other side of the story, the British government is going to look at this same incident here, and they see a situation that's about to spin out of control. People in Parliament are recognizing that, okay, maybe the presence of all these British troops in Boston is not such a good thing. And of course, the people protesting these taxes, maybe we need to ease off a little bit and try to diffuse this situation. As if we send in more troops to try and squash this uprising, that's just going to escalate things unnecessarily. It's going to make matters worse. So what happens in basically the following month, in April of 1770, Parliament is going to repeal a lot of the Townshend Acts. All these taxes on imports, these non-luxury goods, they're all going to be repealed except for the tax on tea. The tea tax will remain because, again, they still need to raise money. They still need to generate revenue, and taxation is the best way to do that. Tea was the most widely used commodity in the colony, at least among that list of things being taxed. Tea was the most widely used, so it seemed obvious to leave the tax on tea, and they repealed the rest of those taxes. So for the next couple years, things are going to be settled down. It's really important to remember that the people on the side of the British government who decided to repeal the Townshend Acts, people on the colonial side like John Adams, who kind of forced us to take a step back and approach this with calm and cool emotions. They're probably responsible for preventing this situation from escalating out of control. This situation could very easily have blown up into a full-scale war had it not been for these few men who decided to try and approach it more calmly and rationally. So things are going to settle down for a couple years as a result. People go back to their lives, business returns to normal, and people move past this. They're not going to forget about it. They're not going to forget about this Boston Massacre because it left an impression on everybody's mind. And it'll come up again later on as the situation becomes more intense later on. They'll recall this Boston Massacre, and it'll become one of the rallying cries that they use to generate support later on. A couple years later, 1773, Parliament is going to pass the Tea Act. The Tea Act was part of I guess the modern day term would be a corporate bailout. Very often in situations in economic history, governments will pass regulations or reduce regulations in an attempt to try and help some of their domestic industries thrive. And that's what's happening with this Tea Act. Over the years, a lot of the people in the colonies who were purchasing tea, they purchased it on the black market from Dutch traders. So smuggled tea, Dutch traders would smuggle tea into the colonies and sell it at a much reduced price compared to the English tea. And consumers are always looking for a bargain. I'd like to save a few bucks here. I'm operating on a budget. I want to buy some tea. The British tea is kind of expensive, but I know this Dutch guy. He comes in once a month and he always sells me a little bit of tea under the table, off the record, and I can pick it up at a bargain. So again, people are not thinking in terms of defying the law. They're just thinking in terms of saving a few dollars. But enough people are doing this over a long enough period of time, and it starts to have an impact. The British East India Company, they're just a trading company, and they dealt in large quantities of tea. Most of the tea, or the British tea sold in the colonies, was brought in by this British East India Trading Company. Well, over the years, they've lost a lot of money because of this, the smuggled tea and black market tea and so on and so forth. And they're in trouble. They're in the risk of going out of business, going bankrupt. What the British government does is we've got a new prime minister in Parliament now, Lord North. Lord North is pro-business. He's sympathetic to this East India Tea Company, and he wants to help them out. So he gets Parliament to pass the Tea Act. Basically what this does is this allows the British East India Trading Company to ship their tea directly to the colonies without going to England to have it taxed and inspected. And of course this was part of the Navigation Acts. All commodities going into the colonies had to come through England first. Well, basically the Tea Act is giving the British East India Trading Company special permission to avoid coming to England to have their tea taxed and then selling it to the colonies. They can go directly to the colonies. So this is going to eliminate a lot of shipping time, a lot of expense, and it's going to enable the British East India Company to sell their tea in America at a much reduced price. So again, making it a more attractive purchase, and then hopefully that will help get their business going again. So the Tea Act was not intended. In fact, when they passed the Tea Act, it was with very little thought over its impact on the colonies. They were just trying to help out a struggling company, a struggling trading company. And the bottom line is that the price of tea, the price of British tea in America now is actually cheaper than the black market tea. So from the consumer's perspective, this should be a good deal. I can still buy tea. I can buy the British tea legally, and I can save money in the process. So from Parliament's perspective, they're thinking that this is a win-win. We're going to help out this company. We're going to lower the price of tea, so that should make the colonists happy too, and it should help eliminate a lot of the smuggling because there's no reason to buy the Dutch tea because it's going to be more expensive now. Well, the exact opposite is true here. This Tea Act, it completely backfires on the British government. They are expecting this Tea Act to kind of solve a lot of their problems, to kind of reduce some of the tension in the colonies over taxes by making tea less expensive. It'll help out British company, thus boosting the economy. So from Parliament's perspective, they think this is going to work out perfectly. But here in the colonies, they see it, they interpret this in a completely unexpected way. Groups like the Sons of Liberty, they see this Tea Act as it's a trick. The British government is just trying to trick us into paying these old Townshend Acts on tea, the Townshend tax on tea. They're just trying to trick us. They're just trying to control us. They're passing these laws without our consent, and this is just another way that the British government is trying to control our lives here in the colonies. So I use this to kind of support the point I made earlier in the week about colonial protest about British taxes. It's not just about the money. Yes, the money is important, but if it were just about the money, the colonists would have been happy about this Tea Act because this is actually going to save them money. The fact that they get so upset over this suggests that the real issue here is not just money. It's not just about the cost of tea. It's about the fact that the British government is passing these laws and these regulations that have an impact on the colonies, and the colonies still have no voice in the British government. This idea of taxation without representation is still at the core of their protest. So it's not just about the money. There are other bigger issues that the colonists are upset about, and this Tea Act is just the most recent example of what they've been complaining about, this lack of representation. So in response to the Tea Act, the colonists are going to launch another wave of protests and boycotts, and of course, as we see here, pictured in this illustration of the Boston Tea Party, another example of vandalism as a form of protest. What will end up happening is that once word of the Tea Act spreads to the colonists will respond by boycotting any kind of tea brought in by British ships. And it's pretty effective too. Sons of Liberty now has branches and groups in all the colonies, and they organize themselves, and they blockade several of the harbors in the colonies to prevent British ships from bringing tea in. Now, this is not a wholesale blockade of any of British goods. This is just a boycott on tea. So regular British trading ships are allowed to come into the colonial ports, no problem. Any ships from the British East India Company carrying tea are going to be blockaded. And they do this pretty effectively. In most of the colonies, no British East India ships were allowed in. But in the city of Boston, again here our attention focuses in Boston, the governor, a guy named Tom Hutchison, he's the royal governor of Massachusetts. Guy was appointed by the king, so he's sympathetic toward the crown. Hutchison, the governor of Massachusetts, is determined to adhere to this new British law, the Tea Act. So he makes sure that the British East India Company ships are allowed into Boston Harbor and that they are able to be secured and begin unloading their cargo. What happens though is that the Sons of Liberty decide to take action here and get around this. So dressed, and of course we've all heard the legend of the story, dressed as Native Americans, the Sons of Liberty led by Samuel Adams, will will sneak into Boston Harbor and they'll board these British East India ships and they'll begin throwing all of the tea cargo into Boston Harbor. Now, as wild and reckless as this seems on the surface, they did have a plan. They, since this was a protest against the Tea Act, they didn't just destroy the ships or destroy everything. They only threw the tea cargo into the ocean. All the rest of the cargo on these ships was left untouched. Again, they're trying to make a statement here. They're trying to make a point about this Tea Act. They're not really doing anything else. Now, what's interesting too is that their whole disguise as Native Americans is kind of a farce. They weren't fooling anybody, and they weren't really trying to fool anybody. Everybody knew who these guys were, and as you can see, this artist here has illustrated one of the facts of this matter. This wasn't a secret either. There was a large crowd of people gathered on the wharf that were clapping and cheering as these Sons of Liberty were carrying out their mission here. So this was no secret. Everybody knew who these guys were. They were dressed as Indians, just as they're just kind of making a show of it, just kind of making it a farce. No one had seen a real Indian in Boston area for decades, so nobody really believes that these are actual Indians. But this is another one of those events that's going to become woven into the fabric of our culture. While in the end it's kind of a small scale event, just a handful of Sons of Liberty destroying the tea cargo on a couple of ships in Boston Harbor, and in the end, I think it was in today's money is about $800,000 worth of tea is destroyed. Now that's expensive. That's a lot of money. So this is gonna be a big loss for this East India Company. But no one was killed. No one was hurt in this project, in this process. It was just the vandalism of this tea cargo. But it didn't change anything. The tax on tea still remained. They're just making a point here. When on the surface it seems kind of a small scale event, this becomes kind of a symbol of American protest over government oppression, and this incident will be referred to and told and retold again through the generations as kind of an example of this American spirit of independence, and we won't subject ourselves to any kind of oppression. The taxation without representation, again, here's the core issue. It's not just about the money. So a relatively small scale incident is going to become a symbol for American protest toward England. So much so that, look at another example here, this other illustration. This is a modern illustration here. I found this a few years ago. A modern artist has recreated the Boston Tea Party out of Legos. And of course, this is just an example of how this incident has become part of our cultural identity. The Boston Tea Party, it's one of our legends, one of our formative moments here in terms of American identity. And even today, artists still revisit this theme with their work. After the dust settles on this Boston Tea Party, the British government is going to look at it very differently than the American people. All those people gathered there together on the docks, cheering and clapping as the Sons of Liberty carried out their deed. They saw it as just a fun statement. We've shown England we're not going to stand still for these taxes, these arbitrary rule over our life here in the colonies. And everybody's kind of feeling pretty good about themselves. England doesn't dismiss this quite so easily. England looks at this and they see this as kind of the last straw, especially since it happens in Boston. Parliament has already developed a bad feeling toward the city of Boston because Boston is this epicenter of protest. When word of this Boston Tea Party gets back to England, the King and Parliament, they're going to be like, you know what? That's it. We are so sick and tired of hearing about Boston this, Boston that. Boston is unhappy. They're complaining and griping and they're tearing up stuff. Finally here, this is the last straw. So Parliament passes what they refer to as the Coercive Acts. And this is in the This is in the summer of 74. The Boston Tea Party takes place in the fall of 73, or winter of 73, and then of course in the spring, summer of 74, Parliament will pass these coercive acts. It's important to note here that among all these laws and acts that Parliament has been passing in the recent years, this coercive acts in 1774, this is aimed specifically at Boston and Massachusetts. This does not apply to any other colony in the British Empire. This is aimed only at Massachusetts, and it's intended to punish Boston for the Boston Tea Party. England is fed up with Boston. They're fed up with Massachusetts, and they're what they perceive to be rabble-rousing and instigating and troublemaking. England now is taking steps here to try and stop this once and for all. So without punishing all 13 colonies, again, this is not a law. This law doesn't apply anywhere except in Massachusetts. England is trying to punish Boston, trying to make an example out of them. They see Boston as a troublemaker, as a ringleader. They figure if they can somehow bring Boston to heel, then they can set an example that the other colonies will all get in line. They'll see what happens to Boston if they press the British government too hard. This is what happens to somebody who goes against England. They're going to be dealt with severely, and so all these other colonies will get in line. And this is the assumption that England is making here. They are assuming that all the other colonies will see what happens to Boston, and they won't dare cause any more trouble. We'll find out here in a minute that that's not exactly how it plays out. So in order to punish Boston, these coercive acts, as they're referred to in England, as a series of this. There's four big parts of this coercive act. One is the Boston Port Act. And this is no surprise, since the incident took place in Boston Harbor, it's no surprise that England is going to close the port of Boston. So basically what this does, the Boston Port Act completely shuts down the Boston Harbor. No ships coming in, no ships going out. All trading in Boston Harbor is shut down. So there's nothing being exported, nothing being imported into Boston. And this is an attempt to basically this will remain in effect until the city of Boston pays for the tea that was damaged. So essentially, Parliament says, okay, you people in Boston need to come up with $800,000, or your port is going to remain closed until that happens. Now, keep in mind that all trade happening in the world in 1774 takes place by boat. So closing down the Boston Harbor, this is gonna cripple the economy of Massachusetts, because if you're a Boston merchant and you deal in trade goods, you're not going to have anything to trade because there are no ships coming into Boston. So you're not going to have any supply of manufactured goods to sell at your store, which means you're probably going to go out of business. If you're a farmer and you sell farm products or livestock to other colonies or to England, well, you're not going to be selling anything either, because the only way to get your stuff out of Boston is on a boat, and that port is shut down. So this is gonna really put a big damper on Massachusetts' economy. So kind of hit them where it counts in their wallets. The next one on the list is the Administration of Justice Act, and this is kind of England's attempt to kind of prevent what happened in the wake of the Boston Massacre. Remember, the soldiers of the Boston Massacre were put on trial here in the colonies, while they were defended by a fair-minded attorney. That attorney was still a Boston resident. This Administration of Justice Act is intended to prevent things like that. Basically, what it says is that any colonial official who is charged with a crime will be put on trial in England, not in Massachusetts. This is Parliament saying that we don't believe that colonial officials will receive fair treatment in a Massachusetts court. So we're going to try to put them on trial in England, where they'll get a more fair trial. So basically, this pretty much, England says they no longer have any faith in the colonial government. We don't acknowledge the legitimacy of the Massachusetts colonial courts. This third one is the big one. This is the one. This is the important one. You need to put a star next to this in your notes, highlight it. Whatever you do to draw attention to important things, you need to make sure that you remember this Massachusetts Government Act, because out of all these, this is probably the one that does the most damage to Massachusetts in terms of their attitude and their spirit. The Massachusetts Government Act, basically, it dismantles the Massachusetts colonial government and replaces it with a military governor. So basically they appoint a new governor, a guy named General Thomas Gage. He's a British Army officer. He is now the new governor of Massachusetts, and he receives additional troops to help him enforce law. So Massachusetts is effectively put under martial law with this Massachusetts Government Act. And in addition to that, in addition to martial law, they disband the Massachusetts General Court. Okay, you're not gonna have any say in local laws anymore. There's no representative assembly in Massachusetts anymore after this. Individual town meetings can only take place once or twice a year. So again, a lot of this is kind of reminiscent of that old Dominion of New England, where they stripped away the colonial governments and replaced it with a royal governor. That's what's happening here in this Massachusetts Government Act, but it's only focused on Massachusetts. This doesn't apply anywhere else in any of the 13 colonies, just Massachusetts. So no more town meetings, no more local government. Everything is going to be ruled kind of arbitrarily by a military governor who is now enforcing martial law. This is a big deal. All local officials, there's not going to be any elections. No local officials are going to be elected anymore. They'll all be appointed by the military governor. So basically, all forms of local government have been disbanded in the colony of Massachusetts. And keep in mind the tradition in Massachusetts. The city of Boston and the colony of Massachusetts as a whole was founded on ideas of independence and self-governance. It's one of their traditions. So for the past 150 years, the people of Massachusetts have had ingrained in their thinking, in their way of life, this idea of self-government. And to have that all stripped away with one new law here, this is going to hit them where it hurts the most. This is kind of sacred to the people of Massachusetts, this idea of self-government, and now they're not allowed to have any say at all in their local government, and this is going to hit them basically where it hurts. To add icing on this cake of misery, a new quartering act will be passed, and again, this only applies to Massachusetts. In this new quartering act, the military governor, General Gage, is given kind of a blank check here to quarter his troops wherever he sees fit. And what ends up happening is that in a lot of instances, soldiers can be lodged in any uninhabited structure. And there's a lot of gray area here. Uninhabited could mean an abandoned building, an abandoned barn, or a storehouse, or a warehouse, or something like that. It could also mean your home or your farmhouse if you happen to be gone for the day. So you say you're a farmer on the edge of town there, you're out in your field doing some work, your wife is in town doing the shopping, there's nobody in your house, it is now uninhabited, which means the British soldiers can move in there and occupy it, and you have no say whatsoever, according to this new quartering act. Now, this is not going to happen to everybody. Everybody in Boston is not going to be affected by this, but enough people will to where it's going to create a lot of extra tension in the city of Boston. And again, something like this, it only has to happen once or twice for it to become an issue. So all these things combined are part of the coercive acts, and the intent here is to punish Boston for not just the Boston Tea Party, but for all the trouble that they've been causing, again, in the eyes of the British government. The British government sees Boston as the ringleader, the troublemaker, and if they can squash Boston, then they can get the other colonies to fall in line. Two, what happens here is that a lot of this is based on an assumption. From the British government's perspective, they look at the 13 colonies as 13 separate individual entities. None of them having anything to do with each other. All of them having a closer relationship with England than they do with each other. This is a false assumption. Because remember, earlier in the week, we talked about some of the things that were starting to promote colonial unity. And even last week, we talked about some of the ideas that were starting to connect the colonies to each other. So there's at this point there's a lot greater sense of colonial unity than the British government has been aware of. And England thinks that, okay, we're just, all the trouble starts in Boston, we'll squash Boston, and that'll be the end of it. You know, the other colonies will see what happens here, and they're not really involved with this anyway, but they'll see it, and they won't want to cause any trouble. This has exactly the opposite effect as England intended. By the time, of course, people in the colonies will hear about this. Word of this will spread all through the colonies. They'll all hear about it. By the time word spreads around, they're referring to it as the intolerable acts. The colonial newspapers are calling this an outrage. These intolerable acts, and we're talking about the same thing. The coercive acts is what it's called in England. The colonists refer to it as the intolerable acts. Same group of laws here. So if you see these two terms, they are one and the same. So in the colonies, they are calling this the intolerable acts because it is intolerable. It is outrageous that the British government would dare to strip a colony of its right to govern itself locally. It's an outrage. It's monstrous. It's horrible. And there will be widespread sympathy for Boston among the other colonies. Even as far away as South Carolina and Georgia, there's sympathy for Boston. Even though South Carolina and Georgia don't have that much dealing with Boston directly, they sympathize with them. The other colonies they're thinking to themselves, if this can happen in Boston, what's to stop it from happening here in our colony? And this outrage over what happens in Boston with these coercive acts, this leads to colonial unity. This more than anything else is one of the things that's going to generate a huge amount of unity among these 13 colonies. They will now start really thinking of themselves as united in this common cause, the threat of English oppression. So this completely backfires on the British government. They're hoping to punish Boston and bring an end to colonial protest over taxes. Exactly the opposite happens, and we see the colonies unifying in a way that they never had prior to this. And that brings us to the First Continental Congress. This is the end result of these coercive acts. Just like in the past, when colonies had sent representatives to an assembly to discuss common issues, remember during the French and Indian War, the Albany Conference, and then later on the Stamp Act Congress. There's already a precedent for the colonies coming together to address a common issue. These coercive acts and what happens to Boston and Massachusetts becomes a catalyst for renewed interest in working together. So the colonies will join together here. They'll come together in Philadelphia in September of '74. And again, this is just a few months after the coercive acts. Coercive acts are passed in the summer of '74. Just a few months later, the colonies are meeting together in Philadelphia to discuss how they're going to deal with this situation. So colonial unity is what comes out of these coercive acts, not an end of protest. Protest just becomes more organized and more focused. So what are we talking about when we meet in Philadelphia in the fall of '74? We are talking about how we are going to respond to this latest act of oppression on the part of England. Just like we talked about with the Stamp Act Congress, the representatives here in Philadelphia are going to draft a formal petition, the Declaration of Grievances. And this is another example of how, at this point, the colonies are still trying to work within the system. They're trying to work within British law to address an issue they have with their government. Nobody is talking about independence in Philadelphia in '74. They're talking about how can we get England to relent on these taxes? How can we get England to back off of these punitive type laws designed to punish the colonies? So in this formal petition, this Declaration of Grievances, they deny, and of course it's important to note here too that this Declaration of Grievances is worded quite a bit differently than our Declaration of Grievances from the Stamp Act Congress. This one is much more harshly worded. The language is a lot stronger. There's a lot more strong opinions put forth here in this one. It's a little bit more to basically they've raised the bar a little bit. They've kicked it up a notch. So in this declaration of grievances, harsh language is used. It conveys an attitude, a little bit more of a belligerent attitude toward the British government. They denounce the coercive acts as unconstitutional. These coercive acts are a violation of our constitutional rights as British subjects. It's a violation of our rights as British citizens. So again, they're speaking within the law here. They're trying to work within the system. They petition the king to intervene. This is King George III at this point. King George, please use your influence to get Parliament to try to relent, to back off of these oppressive laws. Get Parliament to change their mind. The king shares power with Parliament, so the king still has quite a bit of influence here. And this petition is asking the king to use his influence to try and convince Parliament that these laws are unjust. In addition to the strong denunciation of the coercive acts and the petition to the king, they indicate another round of boycotts. Basically, anything that the boycotts are going to be pretty much wholesale at this point. They're not focused on any one product. This is all British goods. They encourage the colonies to not import anything from England. If you can make it yourself, don't buy it from England. If you can't make it yourself, then learn how to do without it. Don't buy anything from England. We won't import any British goods into the colonies. And of course, this is going to hit the British economy hard because the 13 colonies in North America are a huge market for British goods. So if the colonies are not importing any British goods, British manufacturers are going to take a big hit here. And they also declare that they will not export anything to England. So, and of course, this is kind of self-defeating. They're not going to be able to, they're going to have to sell all their stuff somewhere else if they want to make any money. But again, this is kind of a wholesale boycott of British trade. This last item here, this is kind of an important one because this one kind of foreshadows the coming revolution. The last item in this declaration of grievances is that now they're not trying to threaten the English government here. They're just trying to indicate that these issues are so important to us, we are willing to fight to protect our rights. So they call for the colonists to begin arming themselves just in case we have to fight to protect our rights. We will. So this is not really a threat to the British government. It's just kind of an FYI. Hey, King George and Parliament, we believe that our rights are being violated, and we are so serious about this, we will be willing to fight to protect our rights if we can't get some kind of reconciliation here. The intent of this declaration of grievances is to try to find some sort of reconciliation with the British government. They are working within the system here, trying to get the British government to back off of some of these oppressive laws. Nobody's talking about independence in this First Continental Congress. Take a look at our illustration here. Here's just an artist's portrayal of the First Continental Congress. This is most likely Samuel Adams here speaking before the Congress, trying to gain support for a more harsh stance against England and their laws. But even in this moment where emotions are high and people, all these colonial leaders, they are frustrated and angry with England over what's happened with the coercive acts, no one is talking about independence here. They are talking about finding a way to work within the British legal system and try to get some relief from these harsh punishments. The final thing that they discuss at this First Continental Congress is an agreement to reconvene again in the spring. It's, okay, we've drafted this petition. We sent it off to England. We sent a copy of it off to England. It's got all our signatures on it. We're going to wait now and see what England says. So let's all come back here next spring. We'll reconvene here in Philadelphia, and we'll see how England has responded to our petition, and we'll go from there. If they respond positively, then we can move forward. If they respond negatively, then we'll address that at that time. So no firm decisions or stances are taken here at this First Continental Congress. They draft the petition, they send it off to England, and then they agree to just kind of wait and see what happens. That's where our story is right now. We are waiting to see what England happens. When we come back next week, we'll pick it up with England's response to this petition drafted by the First Continental Congress. In addition to that, there will be several incidents and events that take place between the First Continental Congress and England's response to their petition that are going to kind of escalate things and change the priorities a little bit. So that's where we'll pick up our story next week. Until then, we'll see you.